Section 47 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 2, by Henry Gray. Muscles and Fasciae of the Forearm, Part 2. 2. The dorsal antebrachial muscles. These muscles are divided for convenience of description into two groups, superficial and deep. The superficial group, brachioradialis, extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis, extensor digitorum communis, extensor digiti quinti proprius, extensor carpi ulnaris, and coneus. The brachioradialis, supinator longus, is the most superficial muscle on the radial side of the forearm. It arises from the upper two-thirds of the lateral supracondylar ridge of the humerus and from the lateral intermuscular septum, being limited above by the groove for the radial nerve. Interposed between it and the brachialis are the radial nerve and the anastomosis between the anterior branch of the profunda artery and the radial recurrent. The fibers end above the middle of the forearm in a flat tendon, which is inserted into the lateral side of the base of the styloid process of the radius. The tendon is crossed near its insertion by the tendons of the abductor pollicis longus and extensor pollicis brevis. On its ulnar side is the radial artery. Variations. Fusion with the brachialis. Tendon of insertion may be divided into 2 or 3 slips, insertion partial or complete into the middle of the radius, fasciculi to the tendon of the biceps, the tuberosity or oblique line of the radius, slips to the extensor carpi radialis longus or abductor pollicis longus, absence, rarely doubled. The extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis longeur, is placed partly beneath the brachioradialis. It arises from the lower third of the lateral supracondylar ridge of the humerus, from the lateral intermuscular septum, and by a few fibers from the common tendon of origin of the extensor muscles of the forearm. The fibers end at the upper third of the forearm in a flat tendon, which runs along the lateral border of the radius beneath the abductor pollicis longus and extensor pollicis brevis. It then passes beneath the dorsal carpal ligament, where it lies in a groove on the back of the radius common to it and the extensor carpi radialis brevis, immediately behind the styloid process. It is inserted into the dorsal surface of the base of the second metacarpal bone on its radial side. The extensor carpi radialis brevis, extensor carpi radialis brevior, is shorter and thicker than the preceding muscle beneath which it is placed. It arises from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus by a tendon common to it and the 3 following muscles. From the radial collateral ligament of the elbow joint, from a strong aponeurosis which covers its surface, and from the intermuscular septa between it and the adjacent muscles. The fibers end about the middle of the forearm in a flat tendon, which is closely connected with that of the preceding muscle, and accompanies it to the wrist. It passes beneath the abductor pollicis longus and extensor pollicis brevis, then beneath the dorsal carpal ligament, and is inserted into the dorsal surface of the base of the 3rd metacarpal bone on its radial side. Under the dorsal carpal ligament the tendon lies on the back of the radius in a shallow groove, to the ulnar side of that which lodges the tendon of the extensor carpi radialis longus and separated from it by a faint ridge. The tendons of the 2 preceding muscles pass through the same compartment of the dorsal carpal ligament in a single mucous sheath. Variations. Either muscle may split into 2 or 3 tendons of insertion to the 2nd and 3rd or even the 4th metacarpal. The 2 muscles may unite into a single belly with 2 tendons. Cross slips between the 2 muscles may occur. The extensor carpi radialis intermedius rarely arises as a distinct muscle from the humerus, but is not uncommon as an accessory slip from one or both muscles to the second or third or both metacarpals. The extensor carpi radialis accessorius is occasionally found arising from the humerus with or below the extensor carpi radialis longus and inserted into the first metacarpal, the abductor pollicis brevis, the first dorsal interosseous, or elsewhere. The extensor digitorum communis arises from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus by the common tendon from the intermuscular septa between it and the adjacent muscles, and from the antebrachial fascia. It divides below into 4 tendons, which pass, together with that of the extensor indicis proprius, through a separate compartment of the dorsal carpal ligament, within a mucous sheath. The tendons then diverge on the back of the hand, and are inserted into the second and third phalanges of the fingers in the following manner. Opposite the metacarpophalangeal articulation, each tendon is bound by fasciculi to the collateral ligaments and serves as the dorsal ligament of this joint. After having crossed the joint, it spreads out into a broad aponeurosis, which covers the dorsal surface of the first phalanx and is reinforced in this situation by the tendons of the interossei and lumbricalis. Opposite the first interphalangeal joint, this aponeurosis divides into 3 slips, an intermediate and 2 collateral. The former is inserted into the base of the second phalanx, and the 2 collateral, which are continued onward along the sides of the second phalanx, unite by their contiguous margins and are inserted into the dorsal surface of the last phalanx. As the tendons cross the interphalangeal joints, they furnish them with dorsal ligaments. The tendon to the index finger is accompanied by the extensor indicis proprius, which lies on its ulnar side. On the back of the hand, the tendons to the middle, ring, and little fingers are connected by 2 obliquely placed bands, one from the third tendon passing downward and lateralward to the second tendon, and the other passing from the same tendon downward and medialward to the fourth. Occasionally, the first tendon is connected to the second by a thin transverse band. Variations. An increase or decrease in the number of tendons is common. An additional slip to the thumb is sometimes present. The extensor digiti quinti proprius, extensor minimi digiti, is a slender muscle placed on the medial side of the extensor digitorum communis, with which it is generally connected. It arises from the common extensor tendon by a thin tendinous slip from the intermuscular septa between it and the adjacent muscles. Its tendon runs through a compartment of the dorsal carpal ligament behind the distal radio-ulnar joint, then divides into 2 as it crosses the hand, and finally joins the expansion of the extensor digitorum communis tendon on the dorsum of the first phalanx of the little finger. Variations. An additional fibrous slip from the lateral epicondyle. The tendon of insertion may not divide or may send a slip to the ring finger. Absence of muscle rare. Fusion of the belly with the extensor digitorum communis not uncommon. The extensor carpi ulnaris lies on the ulnar side of the forearm. It arises from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, by the common tendon, by an aponeurosis from the dorsal border of the ulna in common with the flexor carpi ulnaris and the flexor digitorum profundus, and from the deep fascia of the forearm. It ends in a tendon, which runs in a groove between the head and the styloid process of the ulna, passing through a separate compartment of the dorsal carpal ligament, and is inserted into the prominent tubercle on the ulnar side of the base of the 5th metacarpal bone. Variations. Doubling, reduction to tendinous band, insertion partially into 4th metacarpal. In many cases, 52%, a slip is continued from the insertion of the tendon anteriorly over the opponens digiti quinti to the fascia covering that muscle, the metacarpal bone, the capsule of the metacarpophalangeal articulation, or the first phalanx of the little finger. This slip may be replaced by a muscular fasciculus arising from or near the pisiform.